Hi guys, in this video I'll be installing the star nut, so let's get started. Okay, so what is a star nut and how does it work? A star nut is this little nut here. You get different types of star nut. The star nut is intended for steel and aluminum or aluminium steerer tubes only. It cannot be used within a carbon fiber steering tube unless you have a special sleeve that is first epoxied into the carbon fiber steerer tube. So how does this work? This nut has got, which the nut is in the middle, has got a spring steel leaves on either side, or on the top and the bottom, which then get pressed into the steerer tube to a depth of 10 to 15 millimeters. And once that is been pressed in, it cannot then come out because of these spring steel, what are they called? Spring steel washers, which will then push up against the sides of the steerer tube. The top cap will then screw into that and then sit at the top. Now what this does is, your stem, your steerer tube sits then within the stem, like so. But once you've cut the steerer tube, you cut it 2 to 3 millimeters lower than the top of the stem. Now what this does is, it allows you to, when installing the top cap and screwing it down onto the star nut, it will then force the stem down onto the bearings, preloading the bearings and preventing the fork from moving. And that is the purpose of the star nut. Once that has been done, you tighten up the stem and you're good to go. Now it should also be remembered, when they say 10 to 15 millimeters down into the steerer tube, they are measuring from the bottom here, not the top there. So 10 to 15 millimeters. In this case I've set it to 15 millimeters. Will approximately be to a depth of about there. Now your only limitation is obviously the length of this bolt. You don't want to push the star nut too deep that this bolt cannot reach properly into the star nut itself. So you need to make sure, and as you can see there, if it's at that depth, the thread does come out the bottom of the nut, so it utilizes the entire nut depth. Now before installing the star nut, we need to cut the steerer tube to the correct length. And as you can see here, I have quite a few spaces underneath the stem. And I've done that as this is the bike I'll be using on the trainer, not on the road. So it allows me quite a bit of movement up and down of the stem as I choose. And as I mostly ride mountain bikes, which is a much easier position when cycling, I've placed this up here for now. Because you can always make the steerer tube shorter, but you can never make it longer. So to start off with, I will measure or make a mark where the stem and the steerer tube, or the steerer tube sticks out of the stem. Once I've done that, the fork will have to be removed from the frame. So once your mark has been made, to remove the fork, you loosen the stem, the 2 bolts on either side. And hold the fork at the bottom. As this gets loosened out, the fork may drop out the bottom. Set that aside. Move your spacers. And then slide the fork out. And then there is the mark that I made, which indicates the top of the stem. It should be noted that this is not the mark where the stereo tube will be cut. It will be cut 2 to 3 millimeters lower than this mark. And the reason being is that when the fork is in the frame, there can be slight movement left and right or sideways, and the 2 to 3 millimeters allows preloading of the bearings and then firming up the fork within the frame. So in my case, I will make a mark 2 millimeters lower than this mark, and that's where the stereo tube will be cut. So I will make a mark 2 millimeters lower than the mark I originally made, which is over there. Now this is definitely a case of measure twice, cut once. Once you've cut the stereo tube, that is it. There's no going back. Now there are many ways to cut the stereo tube, one being a hacksaw, another being a pipe cutter. But in my case I will use my bandsaw to make the final cut. So as you can see, I've got the initial mark there. 2 millimeters lower than that is the final mark where it will be cut. And that final mark rests on this side of the blade. So the final cut should be 2 millimeters lower than the mark. Okay, once the cut has been made, I'll just use a file to trim off the edges here. Now to install a threaded nut, there are a few methods that can be used. One of the methods is to take a socket, place it over the top there, and with a hammer bash it in until the required depth. Another method is to take a screwdriver, put it in the middle there, place it there and bash it in. There are also special tools that you can get to install the nut, which I don't have. But another method which really intrigues me and I've never used before is to take a threaded rod, screw on the star nut, and then from the bottom there's another nut that gets tightened, and as you tighten it, it will then pull the star nut into place. Now this method really intrigues me, as I think it's got a higher degree of accuracy in terms of getting the star nut in exactly straight, because the idea is that this star nut needs to be as straight as possible so that this top cap is not pulled skew. So I'm going to be using this threaded rod method for the first time, and let's see how that goes. Okay, so what I've made is a piece of wood with a hole through, so the threaded rod can fit through there. I then have a washer with another nut. On the bottom of this fork, I don't know if it's really going to be visible, is a hole. It is a very small hole. So if you ever wanted to get the star nut out, it would have to be drilled out. You can't knock it straight through and out the bottom. So then this will then push up. This will then push up through the bottom of the fork, like so. And then the star nut will be threaded onto the threaded rod as follows. Also like this method, I haven't used it before, but the idea of it I like, as you're not bashing on the fork, you're just providing constant pressure. So I will just tighten up the nut at the bottom, until it becomes tight. Make sure that everything is straight there at the top. You can feel now it's getting tight. I'll then take my spanner and start tightening. And as I tighten, the nut should start pushing in. It's obviously important that the rod doesn't turn, which it is turning now, although I don't think that really makes a difference, but I'll try to prevent that from happening by just holding the rod at the bottom. Okay, it's getting quite tight. The rod is screwing in. I don't think that really makes a difference. Now, as you can see, the nut is starting to move in. This is obviously a much slower method than hitting it in with a hammer. Once it starts going, it actually becomes quite easy. And as the second part starts to move in, it becomes much harder to actually turn the nut at the bottom. Obviously you've got double the friction occurring on the nut. What I've done is I've placed a cloth now between the fork and the threaded rod so as to protect the fork from the spanner slides off. There's really stuff going now. As you can see, it is pulling in quite nicely. It's actually interesting. It's very difficult until the star nut actually goes inside the stereo tube, and then it actually becomes a lot easier to turn the threaded rod. So once you have overcome the initial friction of getting the nut inside the tube, it becomes a lot easier to go. I'll show you what I'm doing from that side. I'm just turning the threaded rod like that. We can check the depth, which is got to go quite a far way still. Okay, the depth is now correct, so I will now loosen the nut at the bottom. Loosen the rod itself from the star nut. That should be turning out at the top there. Anything with this method is a bit time consuming. The rod gets pulled out. As you can see, there's no damage to the fork whatsoever. Star knot is in. And I must say I'm quite impressed with this method. You don't have to bash on the fork or anything, you just apply constant pressure. So it's the same theory as pressing in a bearing. And I'm surprised that there are no professional tools to do this or use this method. Okay, once the star nut has been installed, it is time to install the fork back into the frame. And once you have applied the required grease, place the spacers back as required. Obviously I have a lot of spacers here, but what this does allow me is to take spacers away, put the stem back in, put a spacer on the top, and then I can adjust the height of the bars as required. The stem on again. Now what you'd normally do is if you had front wheel, back wheel, you put the bike on the ground, and once you install the top cap, you'd rock the bike back and forth slightly, tighten the top cap until there's no more rocking, and then the preload has been set. But as I don't have the front wheel, I will just tighten it down, straighten the bars, tighten the top cap. Now, there is no torque spec for the top cap, it's just a matter of tightening it to the point where everything works correctly without any rocking and back and forth. Once you have done that, you can then tighten the stem bolts again to the required 5 Newton meters. And that's it, guys, and please don't forget to like and subscribe.